You're watching Reality Check. The jury may still be out on the Modi government's record of handling the economy, but if there is one area where the government seems to have managed so far is in controlling inflation. So far. Perhaps well aware of how rising inflation had turned out to be a politically challenging issue for the UPA. During much of UPA 2, inflation was on the up, over 10%, falling after the Modi government came to power, but now for the first time it's climbing back up. One of the reasons it was under control is because in March of 2016, the Modi government amended the RBI Act, which entails the RBI to ensure inflation would remain between 2 to 6%. But this 6% threshold has now been breached for the first time since 2014. The two main reasons for this appear to be a massive spike in edible oil prices as well as an increase in fuel prices. Edible oil prices are up across the board, almost 50% for sunflower oil, vanaspati, soya, palm, mustard. They're all up. On an average, about 40% increase in edible oil prices. That's because international prices for these oils are rising, and India meets more than half of its domestic demand through imports. The government has cut import duties on edible oils, which has brought prices down a bit, but still, it is worrisome. Also stoking inflation are rising prices of fuel, which have risen by close to 20% in the last 6 months in a city like Delhi. The government, states and centre can bring down fuel prices by reducing fuel taxes, but that's not happened yet. In fact, the central government appears to have increased excise duties on fuel to earn more money, perhaps, in this cash-strapped time of the pandemic. All right, let me go first straight across to P. Chidambaram, senior leader of the Congress party, as well as former finance minister. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chidambaram, for joining us on the show. Now, you have led the Congress charge, as it were, against the government for not being able to control inflation. But if the government were to turn around and say, look, these are because of external factors not in our hands, like edible oil prices, for instance, which are rising around the world, so how can you fault us for that?
These are not external factors. But taxes on petrol, taxes on diesel are not external factors. I've mentioned the numbers in my opening statement yesterday. When crude oil prices were $125 a barrel, we were able to give petrol, the UPA government is able to give petrol at 65 rupees and 45 rupees respectively.
Sure.
Why is it so high? It is because there is a 33 rupees cess on petrol and a 32 rupees cess on diesel, which is not an external factor. Okay. It's entirely the government's doing of levying a cess and collecting something like 4,20,000 crore rupees every year. So how do you blame external factors?
Okay, so I'll come to fuel in a second, but edible oil?
Edible oil, yes. Edible oil prices are rising. But why are you imposing a huge import duty on edible oils? You should reduce the import duty on edible oil and lower prices. I think on oils and fats, inflation is 34.78%.
Right.
Look at the customs duty on edible oil. Look at the customs duty on soybean oil, on palm oil. Okay. I mentioned this in my statement that you have high customs duty on palm oil, pulse, and other household items. Reduce the import duties and prices will come down.
To the argument that could be made that at a time when the government is cash-strapped, revenues are generally down, we need these cesses, we need this additional taxes to make money. You would say what?
I don't agree. Year before last, in the first pandemic year, you gave away 1,45,000 crore as tax rebate to the corporate sector. And today, the newspapers have reported the amount of loans that have been written off for the corporate sector. Between 1920 and 2021, they have written off 4.5 lakh crore rupees. And in the previous year they wrote off another 1.5 lakh crore and 2 lakh crore.
Sure.
So you're giving huge bonanzas to the corporate sector by way of write-off of loan, by way of tax concessions, tax rebate. Why are you doing that? If you need money, you should tap the rich. You should tap the corporate sector.
Well, hold on. Mr. Chidambaram, hold on. You know, as you know, that huge write-offs to corporate sector is not necessarily new. This is something that we've been seeing happen over the years. But overall, in this scenario, were you to be the finance minister and confronted with rising, you know, global crude prices, rising edible oil prices, and the pandemic restrictions on how much revenue you're earning, what would you have done in the government's place?
Three things. Firstly, I'll reduce the cess on petrol and diesel. And as other revenues increase, I will further reduce the cess. Cess is a very bad tax. Cesses are imposed for a specific purpose, for a specific period. Here, cess has become a permanent feature of the BJP NDA taxation policy. Second, I will reduce the import duties on essential goods like palm oil, pulses, and some other household items.
Okay.
Thirdly, I would reduce the GST rates
on
a large number of items which today suffer 12% or 18% GST rate. These include toothpaste, toiletries, processed food, other items, home appliances. So there are ways in which you can give relief to the poor, especially in a pandemic year when they have lost jobs, they have lost incomes, they have lost wages, they are in acute distress. This is the time to give relief.
Now, you would do this, but then you would take a revenue hit. Would that not?
Yes.
But then how would you spend money, which also is important at a time like this?
But the fiscal deficit is no concern in a pandemic year. We have repeatedly said that. Instead, fiscal deficit cannot be a constraint. Even as conservative as a central banker like Dr. Rangarajan has said, fiscal deficit is not a concern today. You must increase your fiscal deficit.
Okay. So you would not worry about ratings, downgrades and all of that at a time like this, which I know that you've said before. But Mr. Chidambaram, you also said, because the other argument, of course, is that petrol prices, fuel prices are also pushed up because of state taxes as well, and there are several non-BJP states which have high taxes. You've said that that's not realistic to expect states to lower taxes at a time like this because there is a problem with revenue sharing with the center, especially given how GST revenues are being shared or not shared. There's almost, I think, as you put it, a breakdown. So is that not an option at all then for states to consider reducing taxes?
Let's get the facts straight. There is a central excise duty. There are state excise duties on petrol and diesel, and there is a cess. The central excise duty exceeds the state's excise duty. That's a fact. Let us assume for the time being that center requires some revenue, states require some revenue, therefore they are allowed to impose some excise duty. Let's assume that each one cancels the other. But what about the cesses? In the price today that you paid this morning, 101 rupees for petrol, 33 rupees, 1/3 is a cess. In diesel, when you pay 95 rupees, 32 rupees is a cess. That is entirely the central government. The state government does not impose any cess. It cannot impose any cess. Entry 97 of list 1 is available only to the central government. So why do you not reduce the cesses? Keep your central excise duty. Let the states keep their state excise duty, but reduce the cess.
Okay, so you're particularly on the cess, which you say is inordinately high, but coming back to this kind of breakdown of trust between the center and the states when it comes to revenue sharing, which is another reason you cited, saying this is not the right time to bring fuel under the GST. But you're saying that were there not to have been that breakdown, or if that gets resolved as those trust factors, then it's okay, is it, to bring fuel prices under GST?
That's the idea. That's the intention, that all products must come under GST, including petroleum products. In fact, the constitutional provision allows for other items which are kept out for the time being to be brought under GST. And I am on record as saying that petroleum products must eventually be brought under GST. But given the complete trust deficit, the states don't trust the center at all to distribute the GST compensation fairly and to provide for GST compensation to be collected and given to the states. Where is the question of bringing anything more under the GST? The present GST system is on the verge of collapse now.
But to the point, to the centers, I mean, I'm not saying necessarily they're making this argument, but were they to make the argument that, look, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough revenues to distribute, to meet the commitments.
That's not correct.
Is that
what they have collected, they have not distributed. There are arrears. The Union Finance Ministers admitted there are arrears, and the arrears will be paid. And I put out a tweet giving the arrears for Punjab, Chhattisgarh, and Rajasthan as on the 30th of June. Nobody has contradicted me. I collected it from the states and put out the numbers of arrears of these three states. I also have the arrears of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, but I did not want to take responsibility for putting that out.
Okay. In conclusion, though, are you beginning to see some signs of any kind of turnaround, that inflation is cooling off a bit, and that we might be seeing some kind of stabilization?
I don't think so. 6.3 to 6.26 is statistically insignificant. The real issue is the inflation in pulses, fruit, transport, fuel and light, oil and fats.
Okay.
That fruits may cool down. But it is the petrol and diesel which is driving transport inflation.
Okay.
LPG, which is driving fuel and light inflation.
Right.
Oil and fats is largely imported or substantially imported, and the customs duties are driving that inflation. Unless the government does something about petrol, diesel, LPG, and imported oils, I can't see these high numbers like 11.56 and 12.68 and 34.78 cooling down. I don't see that happening.
Okay, absolutely. Last question to you. If the government were to argue that, look, you have some, a lot of advice to give on managing inflation, but particularly under UPA 2, your government couldn't, and inflation was all over the place.
Inflation was all over the place when someone else was in charge of finance. Go back and look at the years.
But it was still your government, sir.
I agree. I take collective responsibility. If you think I take collective responsibility, I have no doubt about it. I have no hesitation in admitting that.
Right.
But then we did bring inflation under control in 2012 to 13. So there are ways in which inflation can be brought under control.
Okay.
But if I'm a persona non grata, don't ask me for my advice. I give you my advice. Don't take my advice. Take the advice of your own economist, and let's see what you do about inflation and recovery.
All right. P. Chidambaram, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let's go across to panel. We have with us Soumyakanti Ghosh, Group Chief Economic Advisor of State Bank of India, Harish Damodaran, Senior Fellow at Center for Policy Research and Agriculture, Editor at Indian Express. Thank you both for being here. Soumyakanti Ghosh, what did you make of what P. Chidambaram said, that there are ways, government-controlled ways, in which you can cool prices, you can bring down prices, primarily by reducing the inordinate cess on fuel? Is that realistic at all?
No, I think, Srinivas, there are some points which the former finance minister made. I think just if I want to digress a little bit, if you look at the overall inflation number for the last month, 6.26%, out of this, 45% is contributed by oil and fats, oil, by fats and by oil.
Yes.
So basically, yes, crude oil is significantly contributed, and on the oil and fats, the government has recently cut the customs duty. So there has been a decline in some of the prices. But the larger point is that I think given the options which the government has in terms of the revenue, and given the fact that 6 lakh crores is the budgeted revenue number which the center and states are going to collect this year, and this number will be obviously exceeded going by the current trends. So I'm not sure whether the governments will give up this option of taxing the oil. But on the downside, if it is not done, even though inflation may not ratchet up significantly, but the bad thing is that it may actually prove sticky downwards. And in a situation like this one, if it is sticky downwards for a consistent period of time, it can actually harm the purchasing power of the consumers.
Okay. Harish, you've been looking particularly at food inflation. So it's interesting that overall inflation, top line, headline inflation is been going up, but food hasn't been too bad at the moment. Am I right? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, I think barring edible oils, there's not been much of food inflation. I think edible oil prices have gone up by about, say, 50 rupees compared to last year.
Right.
Okay. And it was basically imported inflation.
Right.
And pulses has gone up by about 10-15 rupees, which also is partly imported inflation. But all other commodities, there's been hardly any increase. I mean, you look at whether it is vegetables, whether it is milk, whether it is. In fact, I would say that the real problem is because of the fuel costs. See, what is happening is, it's actually mad what is happening. I mean, if you compare, last year, 25 rupees per liter is the increase in diesel prices. So if you ask me, farmers are squeezed, truckers are squeezed, all small businesses are squeezed. They will not be able to absorb this kind of increase in costs. And the only people who will be able to absorb this will be the big corporates. So which is why you're seeing, share prices are all rising and everything, and they are able to squeeze these suppliers, So what is happening, like, for example, in the case of milk, basically the dairy companies have passed on the burden of higher diesel price by basically slashing the procurement price to the farmers, So I'm not particularly worried about food inflation now, and in fact, edible oil prices, if it's gone up, it's an opportunity. We can actually increase our domestic production, and it is a good signal to farmers. In fact, I don't agree with Mr. Chidambaram that you should slash import duty on edible oils and pulses and all. No, that's a very wrong thing to do, especially during the sowing season. It's it's an imported inflation, whereas fuel is not an imported inflation.
Right.
We know that the crude prices have not gone up so much. It is entirely due to taxes. And these taxes are going to make our farmers, everyone uncompetitive. So you can't squeeze farmers on diesel and then you slash import duties and then you put in stocking controls and all. So I think that's not the right way to do. In fact, this is a good opportunity. The area under groundnut can go up, the area under sesame can go up, the area under soybean can go up.
Okay.
I'm totally against slashing import duties on edible oils. Yeah.
Okay. Soumyakanti Ghosh, but then what's the way out here? Like, how would the government negotiate this tightrope, where on one hand you see prices going up, on the other hand you do need the revenue? What do you do?
So see, I agree with some of the points which Harish made. I think for an extended period of time, if the fuel prices remain at high levels, actually the terms of trade could move against the farmers. And if you actually look at the WPI data for the first 5 months of the current calendar year, you will see that as the food prices have gone up by 2.3%, but the non-food prices has actually gone up by more than 7%. So the terms of trade moving against the rural sector could actually be not a good thing to happen. Now, coming to the options, I think I'll give you some numbers. I think for every 1 rupee loss, every 1 rupee cut in the excise duty, the government stands to lose around 11 to 12,000 crores of the excise duty. And given the way the tax collections have behaved this year, I think if we actually look into the first 3 months or even the 2 months of the current fiscal, the tax collections of the government is actually the best in the last 22 years. So I am not sure whether it could be an appropriate time to rationalize the fuel taxes, but I think there is some fiscal space available with the government. But one thing we need to do.
Hold on. In simple terms, because we have to simplify this for the ordinary
Yes.
viewer, you're saying that the government does have wiggle room to bring down fuel taxes a little bit?
Yes, it has because of fiscal numbers. These are the tax collections have been very encouraging. Maybe the government is not getting it down because of the uncertainty of the third wave. So there is an element of fiscal space available.
Okay. But Harish, I mean, just let's look at this in the political economy point of view, because this has been a juggling act for all governments, this government particularly. On one hand, you have a simmering, unresolved farm protest, tension there in the countryside, particularly over price realization. On the other hand, you have the middle class, the urban middle class, which is the government's, in a sense, core constituency. Is this going to be a particularly tricky tightrope act for the government?
I think one thing is we need to see how the monsoon pans out. See, last year you had an excellent monsoon. You know, it is a perfect monsoon, and plus thanks to no lockdown, etc. So agriculture on the whole did very well, right? This year the monsoon hasn't been very good. You know, I mean, you had a lot of rains in May, and the monsoon made a huge entry. I mean, you know, where this thing, but then went into completely a sort of a dry phase. You know, and now I think last couple of days it has revived. So we really need to see how the monsoon pans out. You know, as far as food inflation is concerned, and I still believe that the villain is diesel. You know, 25 rupees per litre increase, the economy cannot, we just cannot absorb, you know, especially look at small MSMEs, small producers, anybody, you know, I mean, they already faced GST, they faced demonetization, they faced, you know, lockdown. And with this, with this diesel price hike, you know, they will not be able to absorb, you know, farmers will not be able to absorb this, you know, you need about at least 30 litres per acre for paddy and maybe 10 liters for others. So, you know, you just multiply 25 into 10 or 25 into 30, you know, per acre, your costs are going up by 500 rupees, you know.
Okay.
How will farmers be able to absorb this, you know? And what I fear is now, actually what is going to happen now is the government is going to bring back Essential Commodities Act in a big way. They will bring back stocking restrictions and all these kind of things, you know, raids and all. So your farm laws and all.
They already have in a sense. They've already started putting some some caps on,
and after that it will be
stocking.
edible oil. So again, the squeeze will be on the farmer, you know, whereas the villain is actually the government, you know, by raising the duties so much, you know, and I don't think the government has any alternative other than slash excise duties, you know, on diesel, because we cannot absorb this, you know. See,
all right. We're joined by Praveen Chakravarti as well. Data Analytics Congress was meant to have him on earlier, but he's just been able to join us in the final overs of the game, as it were. Praveen, with very little time left, overall though, you know, we saw how much high prices, inflation hit the UPA, particularly in its second tenure. While definitely prices are up, inflation is still spiking, but is it enough to have a kind of political impact?
Yeah, sorry about having to join late, but very quickly, see the political impact, I know by that you mean an electoral impact, because all of politics comes down to elections, for at least in the media. See, there is inflation and there is inflation. In economic terms, inflation can be when there is demand for goods that is very high, and hence their prices rise. If the demand for goods is high, that means people have extra incomes and they are spending more. And hence the demand goes up and hence the inflation goes up. Or there could be supply side constraints where people are not, their demand is not going up, but there's just not enough supply and prices are going up. Okay. Now what we have today is clearly, as the GDP data shows, people do not have incomes. So this inflation that we're seeing is not because of demand side inflation.
Right.
If people have extra incomes, then at least they feel happy that their incomes are rising, as well as prices are rising. But here it's the exact opposite. And hence, I think
the political impact of a supply side driven inflation is much more sharper than it would be were it to be a demand side inflation.
Okay, well, let's see how that plays out. But thank you all, completely out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us on Reality Check. Thank you for watching. Good night.